Hey there everyone, let's dive into 1979, a huge year, right? Disco was on its way out, but a different kind of revolution was brewing in Iran. But what if it wasn't? What if the Shah, with all his flaws, stayed in power? We're about to explore an alternate reality, a Middle East where everything went down very differently. Buckle up, because this is some serious what-if history. Now, the Iranian Revolution wasn't just some random Tuesday. It was seismic. The Shah, for all his talk of modernization, was seen by many as a puppet of the West, especially the United States. When Ayatollah Khomeini rolled in with his promises of Islamic rule, it resonated with people hungry for change. But imagine just for a second if that hadn't happened. This isn't about saying the Shah was some perfect leader. He wasn't. But his rule, as flawed as it was, represented a different path for Iran and the whole region. Think about it. No Islamic Republic, no Ayatollah calling the shots. Instead, you have Iran, maybe still struggling with inequality and political freedom, but on a different trajectory. And that, my friends, changes everything. So, the Shah stays in charge. What does that even look like? Well, first off, Iran remains a key player in the Cold War, but with a twist. The Shah was no fan of the Soviets, but he also wanted to chart his own course. Picture this: Iran becomes a kind of Switzerland of the Middle East, playing both sides without fully committing to either. This means continued ties to the West, especially in terms of oil and military cooperation. The United States, instead of dealing with the hostage crisis and all that drama, finds a willing partner in Tehran. But here's the thing: the Shah also strengthens ties with non-aligned countries like India and Egypt. He sees himself as a leader of the developing world, not just a pawn in someone else's game. This balancing act keeps everyone guessing. The Soviets are wary, the Americans are cautiously optimistic, and the Middle East sees a different kind of power dynamic emerging. Iran, with its oil wealth and strategic location, becomes a major force, but one that's not explicitly anti-Western. It's a delicate dance, but one that the Shah, for all his faults, might have been able to pull off. Remember the Grand Mosque seizure in 1979? Hundreds of militants taking over Islam's holiest site. It was a wake-up call, a sign of the growing radicalization within the Muslim world. But in our alternate timeline, this never happens. Why? Because the very ideology that fueled the seizure is missing. See, the Iranian Revolution's success emboldened extremist groups across the region. It was like proof that their vision of Islamic rule could become reality. But without that inspiration, groups like Al-Qaeda, which later emerged from the fight against the Soviets in Afghanistan, might never have gained the same traction. Instead of fear and paranoia, Mecca remains a place of peace and reflection. The annual Hajj pilgrimage, instead of being overshadowed by security concerns, becomes a symbol of unity and shared faith. The message from the Muslim world is clear: extremism has no place in Islam. All right, let's talk about the big one, the Iran-Iraq War. This wasn't just some border skirmish. It was a brutal 8-year war that scarred both countries. But in our alternate 1979, it never happens. With the Shah still in power, Saddam Hussein's paranoia about a fundamentalist Iran spreading its revolution never materializes. Think about it. No Islamic Republic, no chance of death to America, no reason for Saddam to feel threatened by his neighbor. Instead of war, we might see tense but manageable relations between Iran and Iraq. They might even cooperate on oil production and regional security. Imagine 1 million lives saved, a generation that doesn't grow up amidst bombs and bloodshed. The economic boom that the Middle East experiences in the 21st century, it starts a decade earlier, fueled by peace and stability. And the rise of extremist groups like ISIS, often linked to the chaos of post-war Iraq, it might never happen, or at least not on the same scale. Section 5. The bear stays home. Afghanistan without Soviet intervention. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 was a turning point in the Cold War, a move that drew the US and its allies into a costly proxy war. But guess what? In our alternate timeline, the Soviets never even set foot in Afghanistan. Why? Because the very instability that prompted their intervention never existed. See, the Soviets were worried about the spread of Islamic revolution from Iran into Afghanistan, which shared a border and had a significant Shiite population. But with the Shah still in power, that threat evaporates. Afghanistan, while still grappling with its internal issues, doesn't become a breeding ground for jihadism. This means no mujahideen, no foreign fighters flocking to Afghanistan, and no Osama bin Laden finding his calling in the fight against the Soviets. The US, instead of funneling weapons and money to Afghan rebels, focuses on other Cold War priorities. The world breathes a sigh of relief as a major conflict is averted. Section 6. Saudi Arabia's path. Still conservative, but less confrontational. Now, let's talk about Saudi Arabia. Even without the Iranian Revolution, they'd still be a conservative monarchy, deeply religious and protective of their interpretation of Islam. But there's a key difference. They're not locked in a regional power struggle with a revolutionary Iran. This means the Saudis might not have felt the need to double down on promoting their own brand of Wahhabism as a counter to Iranian influence. They might have been more open to internal reforms, perhaps even allowing for a more moderate form of Islam to flourish. On the global stage, Saudi Arabia might have taken a less confrontational approach. Instead of funding religious schools and mosques that preached a strict interpretation of Islam, they might have focused on economic development and diplomacy. This could have led to a more nuanced and less polarized understanding of Islam in many parts of the world. Section 7. A region less divided, Sunni-Shia tensions restrained. One of the most tragic legacies of the Iranian Revolution is the deepening of the Sunni-Shia divide. The rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, fueled by religious differences, has played out in proxy wars and sectarian violence across the region. But in our alternate timeline, this divide is far less pronounced. Without the Iranian Revolution to serve as a rallying cry for Shiites, the sectarian tensions that have plagued the Middle East might have remained dormant. Imagine a Middle East where religious identity takes a backseat to national identity, where cooperation between Sunni and Shia majority countries is the norm rather than the exception. This wouldn't mean the end of all conflict, but it would certainly create a more stable and less volatile region. Section 8. The rise of Islamism. A different trajectory. The Iranian Revolution didn't just reshape the Middle East, it also gave rise to a new wave of Islamist movements around the world. Groups inspired by Khomeini's vision sought to create Islamic states in their own countries, often through violence. But without the Iranian Revolution as a model, it's likely that these movements would have evolved differently. Some might have pursued a more gradual and peaceful path to political change, focusing on education and social reform. Others might have abandoned their Islamist goals altogether, recognizing that their societies weren't ready for such a radical transformation. The global war on terror, as we know it, might never have happened. Without the events of 9/11, the US might not have invaded Afghanistan or Iraq, and the world might have been spared the rise of groups like ISIS. This is not to say that terrorism would have disappeared entirely, but it's likely that it would have taken a different form, perhaps less ideologically driven and more focused on local grievances. Section 9. Echoes in the present, from the Arab Spring to global politics. Fast forward to the 21st century. The Arab Spring, a series of pro-democracy uprisings that swept across the Middle East and North Africa in 2011, might have played out very differently without the legacy of the Iranian Revolution. Instead of being seen as a threat by some Arab regimes, the protests might have been met with more openness and willingness to reform. On the global stage, a less volatile Middle East could have led to greater cooperation on issues like climate change, poverty, and nuclear non-proliferation. Imagine a world where the US and Russia, instead of being bogged down in proxy wars, work together to address these pressing global challenges. The rise of populism and nationalism, which has swept across many parts of the world in recent years, might have been blunted by a more hopeful and less divided world. The forces of globalization, instead of being met with fear and suspicion, might have been embraced as opportunities for progress and cooperation. Section 10. A world less frightened. The hope of a more secular Middle East. Look, this is all hypothetical. We can't go back in time and change history. But by imagining a different past, we can start to envision a different future. A future where the Middle East is defined not by conflict and extremism, but by peace, progress, and a vibrant civil society. This doesn't mean ignoring the challenges that still exist, political repression, economic inequality, and the legacy of colonialism. But it does mean recognizing that there are alternative paths to progress, paths that don't involve violence, repression, or the imposition of a single ideology. The Iranian Revolution was a watershed moment, but it wasn't inevitable. By understanding its causes and consequences, we can learn from the past and strive to create a more peaceful and just future for the Middle East and the world. Peace out.